So for more on this, we're joined by our U.S. correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease from our New York headquarters. So Sherwin, opening arguments underway or expected shortly. But yesterday was quite a marathon session, negotiations about amendments from the Democrats. And of course, only a few of those going through. So just explain how this marathon session unfolded.
Yeah, none of them actually going through. All 11 amendments proposed by the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, slapped down via the party line vote of 53 to 47, essentially, of course, Republicans having that majority. But this then dragging out the process, essentially, to adopt the rules resolution introduced by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell yesterday, taking us to about 2 a.m. Wednesday morning, essentially. Two concessions that Democrats were afforded by the Republicans before that final vote took place, affirming the rules resolution. Initially, the proposal indicated that opening arguments for both sides would last 24 hours to Pisa over 2 days. It's now 24 hours over 3 days. So instead of marathon 12-day sessions without a break that could take us to 1 a.m. in the morning, you're now going to have 3 8-hour sessions spread over 3 days. So within 6 days, we'll have heard from both sides if they use all of the 24 hours. Another concession that Democrats won was the inclusion, the automatic inclusion of evidence that was presented in the House impeachment inquiry. That evidence will now become an automatic record of the Senate trial if there are no objections. Initially, McConnell wanted to block all evidence and have each bit of evidence included in the trial record through a majority vote. That has now been deferred. All the evidence will be presented. The third element of those rules, of course, is that senators who are not allowed to speak in this process to PISA will then have 16 hours to raise objections, to ask questions through the Chief Justice. And then this variable, this unknown, which we are not sure of, will the senators then introduce motions that could either subpoena documents from various departments, including the White House, the State Department, the Department of Defense, and crucially, this is one of the big ones that Democrats want in that Senate trial, is will senators move to subpoena witnesses? John Bolton, Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff, among others.
And Sherwin, all of it was going to ride on those rules, and I suppose now making short shrift of that long timeline that people had anticipated. So from all of this, does that mean that within 6 days' time we could possibly see a verdict?
6 days plus 16 hours, right? There might be some questions from the various Republican senators, Democratic senators. Certainly will have some concerns that they will raise. And then the big question is, will they then move to subpoena witnesses and additional documents? If that final step does not happen, then we could vote, actually see Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell move to vote on the 2 articles of impeachment. Do senators therefore believe that the President of the United States abused his power by seeking foreign intervention, essentially in the 2020 election? And do they affirm the 2nd article of impeachment, which talks about the obstruction of Congress by this White House, by the executive during that impeachment inquiry? So that final step will determine the length of this trial. Will they subpoena new witnesses? Will they subpoena additional documentation? Or will they not? So we could, in terms of the timeline, if I were to speculate, have a vote by the end of next week. That would be exceptionally quick, but it all depends on whether senators want to move to call more witnesses.
And speaking of the president, he is headed back to Washington after 2 days of attending the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he's raising national security concerns about allowing certain witness testimony and the likelihood of invoking executive privilege. Let's take a watch.
I would rather go the long way. I would rather interview Bolton. I would rather interview a lot of people. The problem with John is that it's a national security problem. You know, you can't have somebody who's at national security. And if you think about it, John, he knows some of my thoughts. He knows what I think about leaders. What happens if he reveals what I think about a certain leader and it's not very positive, and then I have to deal on behalf of the country? It's going to be very hard. It's going to make the job very hard. He knows other things. And I don't know if we left on the best of terms. I would say probably not, you know. And so you don't like people testifying when They didn't leave on good terms, and that was due to me, not due to him. And so we'll see what happens. But when you have a national security, you could call it presidential prerogative. You could just call it, the way I look at it, I call it national security for national security reasons. Executive privilege, they say.
So, Sherwin, what do we make of the president's concerns?
I mean, he also spoke in Davos, SABC, quote, "We have all the material, they don't have the material," talking to democratic attempts here to subpoena additional documents and witnesses. Look, the president is essentially saying that if John Bolton were now to testify, as the former national security advisor has indicated he would, if he gets a Senate subpoena, that he might be impugning the national security of the United States. But the irony of that statement from the United States president is that he is being charged with abuse of power that speaks very much to his abuse of or undermining the country's national security, essentially withholding the military aid that was earmarked by the United States Congress for Ukraine, for their defensive capacities against the Russian incursion in in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Essentially, the President of the United States is himself being accused of undermining the national sovereignty of the United States. So you can't have it both ways, Mr. President, in this instance. So to say that John Bolton would then therefore be impugning the very thing he's charged of strikes me as a little ironic.
Right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our correspondent out there in the US, just giving us the latest on the issue of the impeachment trial against US President Donald Trump. As we mentioned, he is on his way back to DC from Davos.